Welcome to our sharing on the book of Exodus. I am doing a first reading of the plagues so that we begin to appreciate the marvellous dialogue that went on between Moses and Pharaoh, and the reverence and respect that he showed to Pharaoh and his legitimate authority, and at the same time his utter reverence and obedience to the higher authority, which is God. Do we listen to God rather than men? And so Moses' obedience to God and his humility before Pharaoh are really wonderful to watch. Now, we've been through 3 plagues. 2 of them, a sign was given, and the third one was a punishment from God. So we're starting on the second round of plagues. Again, there will be 2 signs, and the third one will be punishment, and it's exactly the same thing in the third round as well. So let's begin the second round of the signs that God gave to Egypt. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and wait for Pharaoh as he goes down to the water, again on his way to wash in the Nile. Say to him, 'This is the Lord's message. Let my people go to offer me worship.' Nothing has changed. But if you don't let my people go, I will send gadflies to you," is what this translation says, "on your courtiers and on your palaces. The houses of the Egyptians will be infested with them, and even the very ground you stand on. But I will set apart the land of Goshen where my people live. On that day there will be no gadflies there, so that you may know that I, the Lord, am in the midst of the land." This time Moses warns Pharaoh that there's going to be a swarm of flies. Gadflies, they call them, but different translations use different words. And it's a biting insect is what is referred to. In this particular sign, God is going to show Pharaoh, through Moses, that something new is going to happen. And the something new is that the land of Egypt, where all the false gods are being worshipped, and the land of Goshen, which is up in the north, where God's people were dwelling, the chosen people were dwelling, that there was going to be a difference between the two. And we have to look at this for the rest of the plagues. Now, the chosen people did experience the first 3 plagues because they were in need of redemption. So they did need the signs that the others were given as well. And the sign of death for them will be handled in the redemption experience of the Passover, for example. And it is the blood of the Lamb that they will experience for their salvation, not the blood of death. So let's come to this one then, the gadflies. And there's going to be a distinction between the 2 places. So Pharaoh has to hear that God has claimed a particular people as his own. And this particular people are going to have his protection, but the others don't. So the message is, if you are not in right relationship with God, you are not experiencing that wonderful protection that will save you from terrible disasters in your own personal life or the life of your nation, for example. Then he's told that this sign will take place tomorrow. So he's given time to repent or to change his mind. So the Lord did this, and great swarms of flies found their way into the Pharaoh's palace, the houses of the courtiers in the land, and ruined the country. Now, Pharaoh has to hear the detail. This is what's going to happen. This will happen tomorrow, and this is how you're going to be affected. And it happened exactly as Moses said. So he's realizing that whatever this Yahweh says, this God whom he doesn't know, but he's getting to know, that whatever he says actually happens. Now, he has no testimony of anything like that in the whole pantheon of gods that is in Egypt. And we have to know that one of the names given to the demon is Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies. And that is the meaning of the sign. There will be more as well that I will give to you. That this is a sign that they're inundated with the influence of the evil one, and they don't even realize it. So in verse 21, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. Now this is his first time to call them back. Each time it is Moses who has sought an appointment with Pharaoh. This time Pharaoh sends for him urgently because the country is being ruined by these flies. Go, he said, and offer sacrifice to your God, but in this country. Now, the message has been very, very clear from the beginning that the whole people in the land of Goshen are to go to the wilderness and offer sacrifice to God. And one of the problems is that the animals that the Israelites sacrificed to God were animals that the Egyptians worshipped. And so there would be a massive problem among the people if they realized that these Hebrews were actually killing sacred animals. So that wouldn't be right, Moses said, because we sacrifice to the Lord our God animals which Egyptians counted sacrilege to slaughter. So it would be asking for a civil war. Moses said, no, we can't do that. If we offer in front of the Egyptians sacrifices that outrage them, they will stone us. In other words, it'll give you the opportunity to kill us that you're looking for. And Pharaoh has been looking for an opportunity to destroy the Hebrews from the very beginning. So Moses said, no, we're not going down that road. We must take a 3 days journey, this is what he's been saying from the beginning, into the wilderness, a land not owned by anybody, only owned by God, to offer sacrifice to the Lord our God as he commanded us. Now, why is Moses saying, as he commanded us? It's because Pharaoh now knows that whatever Yahweh commands actually happens. That's the important bit. So Pharaoh replied, I will let you go and offer sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, provided you don't go too far. That means it won't be 3 days' journey. Pharaoh knows that 3 days' journey puts this people entirely outside of his political influence, and therefore that what he's looking at is migration. And that is correct. That is what Moses wanted. And that is what God wanted, was that these people would leave this territory altogether and set up home elsewhere. And then Pharaoh says, and intercede for me. Now, that little statement is extremely important because Pharaoh knows that Moses is not a personal enemy of his. He knows that Moses is not trying to take revenge on him or get the better of him or power over him or anything that goes on in political circles. He knows that. He knows that Moses is a man of God, and so he asks Moses to intercede for him. That means that he knows already that if you pray to Yahweh, Yahweh will hear the prayer and Yahweh will respond. He just hasn't said what exactly he wants the prayer for. He hasn't got to that point yet. And so Moses said, the moment I leave you, I will pray to the Lord. In other words, I'm not going to pray in front of you. It's the wrong context. I need to get into a much purer context. Tomorrow morning, the flies will leave Pharaoh and his courtiers and his subjects. Only, he said, and here again you have Moses talking to him like a parent talking to a bold child. Only Pharaoh must not play false again. So I will do what you have asked. God will respond. You know he will take the sign away, but you must not do what you did before, which is to go back on your word. And so it happened. And the Lord did as Moses asked, and the sign was taken away. And what happened? Pharaoh went back to his old position again. So therefore, this calls for a further sign, which we find in chapter 9. It's the 5th plague. So it is important for us to realize that the 10 plagues were not absolutely essential. Pharaoh could have responded to God at any point, and that God would have responded to him, and therefore the next plague would never have happened. It's Pharaoh's hardness of heart, his stubbornness, his refusal to cooperate with God that is calling upon the next sign to be delivered. That is very important. So we've already heard very clearly, God keeps his word, Moses keeps his word, and Pharaoh does not keep his word. So Pharaoh is the one you can't trust. So the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, This is the message of Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews. Let my people go to offer me worship. Pharaoh must know the words off by heart. If you refuse to let them go and you detain them any longer, you will find that the hand of the Lord will fall on your livestock in the fields. Now remember, the first sign was for the river, which was the lifeblood of Egypt. Now the livestock is absolutely essential for their food, and they will experience a deadly plague. Now the Masoretic text and other translations say that this plague was a special murrain among the cattle. The Lord will discriminate between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt. So it's only your livestock that will be touched. God is not punishing his own people who are slowly coming around to cooperate with him. And if Pharaoh had slowly come around to cooperate with God as well, he wouldn't have experienced any more plagues. So the Lord has fixed the hour. Moses said, tomorrow. Now, where did this idea of tomorrow come from? It came from Pharaoh himself. Do you remember back earlier? The Lord will carry out the threat that he has in the land. But Moses asked all of the people, including Pharaoh and his courtiers, to take their livestock in to protect them. And they could have protected their livestock against this plague. But if Pharaoh is not listening and he's not taking this to heart, his livestock will die. But it'll be his own fault. He could have taken them in and put them in shelter. The next day the Lord kept his word. Notice, God keeps his word. And the Egyptian livestock died, but none of them owned by the sons of Israel died. Pharaoh was absolutely shocked. He couldn't believe it. That why should the cattle here die and the cattle there not die? So he had inquiries made, and it was true. He was shocked. This time, the sign is not going to be reversed because the cattle are dead. So will he change his mind? He absolutely digs his heels in and he says no. So this time, God has touched him at a very deep level. In reading the plagues, it might help if you read something of the story of Job in the book of Job, how trials and testings came to him. His family were killed, then his possessions were taken from him, and the trials went deeper and deeper. But Job was a man of God, and he ended up saying, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return to him, blessed be God. But Pharaoh is not giving any personal response to Yahweh at all. And he is just treating Moses as if this is a political negotiation, and that's not going to work. So the sixth plague, therefore, comes as an added punishment. Now, it's bad enough that the cattle in the fields are dead. So the Lord said to Moses, take handfuls of soot from the kiln. The kiln. This is the furnace in which the Hebrews were baking the bricks that made the store cities for Pharaoh, the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. And this was where those bricks were actually made. And he said, take that soot and before the eyes of Pharaoh, in other words, you're now right up to confrontation, he said, throw it in the air. Just in front of his eyes, throw it in the air. And what happened was that boils came all over Pharaoh and his courtiers and the magicians and everybody else. And we're told in verse 11 that the magicians couldn't even face Moses now, because after all, not only could they not remove it, but they knew the meaning of the sign which said that they themselves were unclean. Now the Egyptians had a huge thing about bodily cleanliness, to the point where their priests would only wear white linen when they were doing their liturgical services, and they were so determined on physical purity that they would actually remove all hair from their bodies so that no lice or anything could ever touch them. That's why you can see that these messages are actually touching them at the place where it hurt. Now, to have boils meant that they were being physically deformed, and for them that was a very frightening sign. It indicated the pride with which they were standing up before God and the resistance they were giving to God. So the kiln, I'll come back to that when I come back to explaining about what these plagues are saying to everybody, because the plagues have messages for Egypt, they have messages for the people of God, and they have messages for us. What is God actually saying to us? So I'll give you a hint here that at the very beginning of the book, in chapter 1, we were told that these slaves were utterly crushed by the terrifying work that they had to do in the blistering heat and making these bricks. So it's from that blistering heat that all these blisters come upon the people who caused this. So you're looking at consequences of actions here. And of course, neither Pharaoh nor his magicians have any possibility of doing anything about this, so they have to just simply endure it. There was no warning given. This is a punishment for your resistance to God. So now we come to the third set of the plagues, and these are the worst of all. These are the terrifying ones. They're going to have real consequences. The seventh plague, which we have here in chapter 9, is the terrible storm of hail. Now, in different parts of the earth right now, people are experiencing terrible hailstorms where the pieces of hail can be as big as your hand. Well, if the pieces of hail are as big as your hand, then this is like bombardment from heaven. And people are discovering that their cars and their houses and everything are being destroyed, simply because the sheer weight of this bombardment. So the hail is a very frightening sign. The Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and present yourself to Pharaoh on his way down to the river," the usual. This is the message of Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews. "Let my people go and offer me worship." It's the same thing all the time. This time, I mean to send all my plagues on you. So, the scriptures tell us, and it's in Genesis chapter 6, that my spirit will not always strive with man. In other words, God doesn't have to absolutely strive with us. And there's a certain point at which our resistance to God, our pride, our arrogance, our opposition, our hardness of heart, there's a certain point when God says, enough. That enough is now. They've had the sign of the boils all over them, and now this terrible hail, and the 8th plague, and the 9th plague, and the 10th plague, they won't be able to stop them, because it actually doesn't matter at this particular point what reaction Pharaoh gives. Whether he converts or whether he doesn't convert, he has brought on the 3rd layer of plagues upon himself and his people. So verse 14 says, "This time I mean to send all my plagues on you, on your courtiers and on your subjects, so that you will learn that there is no one like me in the whole world." The whole point is that they have to acknowledge that Yahweh is El Elohim. He is the God of gods. He is Adon Adonim. He is the Lord of lords. There is nobody like him. Now, if you go into the rest of the Bible, and particularly into the Psalms, you'll have the psalmist saying that to the Lord so frequently, "There is nobody like you. There is nobody like you." So, had I stretched out my hand to strike you and your subjects with pestilence, you would have been swept from the earth. In other words, I could have put a disease on you that you'd be all dead by now. But I have let you live for this, to make you see my power and to have my name published through all the earth. Now, God is saying to Pharaoh, the only reason why you're still alive is that I have decided that because of your position as the head of the superpower of the world, that the whole world will hear about me. And that's exactly what St. Paul says in Romans as well. He says it in Romans 9:17. For the scripture says of Pharaoh, I raised you up for this very purpose, that I might display my power in you, that my name might be proclaimed to the ends of the earth. The sadness is that Pharaoh is doing this negatively. It's through Moses it's being done positively. And if we proclaim who the Lord is to the ends of the earth positively, then we're on the Lord's side. And it's sad that Pharaoh is actually on the enemy side. So in verse 17, the Lord says, high-handed with my people still, you won't let them go. So you're still standing in your pride and arrogance before God. Tomorrow, therefore, about this time, notice the tomorrow all the time, I will let fall so great a storm of hail as has never been known in Egypt from the time of its foundation. In other words, this is going to be a terrifying storm. So, have your livestock and everything that is yours brought in from the fields and put under cover. You see, the slaves would be working out in the fields, but everything has to be put under cover. Now, if this is to happen, and the storm is not going to happen in Goshen, then it means that there must be more slaves in Egypt than simply the Hebrew people, because the Hebrew people are going to be spared. Put them under cover, because on man and beast and on all that remains in the fields that is not brought indoors, the hail will fall and they will die. Some of Pharaoh's courtiers, terrified by the Lord's threat, actually did bring in their slaves and their livestock. Some of them didn't. Now, this is a very important point that we have reached. Everybody realizes that whatever Yahweh says actually happens, and that Moses will faithfully carry out Yahweh's command, and that's just the way it is. So the courtiers are now listening to Moses and listening to God through Moses. They're not listening to Pharaoh, and they're not turning to Pharaoh's gods. Notice in this entire process, we're in the 7th plague, there has been no intercession given to false gods. No false god has been called upon. None whatsoever. It's as if they're all absent. It's really interesting. So now there's a difference between Pharaoh and his government. They're all listening to Moses, and Moses is the one who's actually ruling Egypt. So the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hands towards heaven, so that the hail may fall on the whole land of Egypt. And we're going to hear this at the Red Sea as well. Stretch out your hand, and I will divide the waters, and stretch out your hand, and the waters will return. The sign given, the sign taken away. So Moses did stretch out his staff towards heaven, and the Lord thundered and rained down the hail. Now, the word thundered is actually important. Lightning struck the earth. Yahweh rained down hail on the land of Egypt. The hail fell, and the lightning flashing in the midst of it. In other words, hail and fire. We know the symbol of fire already. A greater storm of hail than had ever been known in Egypt since the time it had become a nation. Throughout the land of Egypt, the hail struck down everything in the fields, man and beast. It struck down all the crops in the fields, and it shattered the trees in the fields. Now, this is a preparation for the next one. It is the next attack is going to be on the crops. Only in the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, there was no hail. So, we now have a difference. Egypt is under bombardment from heaven, quite literally bombardment from heaven, and they discover that the land of Goshen doesn't have any storm. How can that be? It's the same heaven. And so, God is actually demonstrating his omnipotence. I can show this sign here, and I don't have to show it there. At a much later time, the time of Amos in the 8th century, he said that if God allowed rain to fall on one field and not on another, that he was punishing the land. That's quite normal nowadays. So at this stage, Pharaoh is absolutely terrified. If you want to get a feel for the storm, there's a wonderful Psalm 29, that actually glorifies God as the Lord of the storm. Let me just read it for you. Ascribe to the Lord, O mighty ones. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due to his name. In other words, God is manifesting his presence in the storm. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness, because in all of these plagues, God is demonstrating his holiness, and he's demonstrating that people living in idolatry and immorality and following false religions and false gods and false hopes, they're not fit for God's presence. That's what he's trying to demonstrate. They all, every one of them, need a redeemer. It isn't just the Israelites. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord thunders over the mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars, the most powerful trees in the Middle East. The Lord breaks into pieces the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf, and Syrian, which is Lebanon, like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning. The voice of the Lord shakes the desert. The Lord shakes the desert of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord twists the oaks and strips the forest bare, and in his temple they all cry glory. Now notice, the voice of the Lord strikes in lightning. He speaks to us in thunder. He thunders. We're going to meet this again on Sinai, that the Lord thunders from Sinai, and they have the lightning and the storm, and they've got all the signs. It's very interesting. It's just that, can God speak to us today? No, we explain everything away scientifically. But when I was a child and I was afraid of the thunder and the lightning, my father wisely said, "Oh, don't worry about that. The good shepherd is bringing home his sheep, and they are thundering along the way. They're making this big noise. It's okay, just trust your shepherd." And it was the right answer to give to a child. Trust your shepherd. It's okay. He will protect you. Now, this is the message that was given in Goshen. They were learning to trust the Lord and to trust that he actually loved them. So he was not thundering to them. He was thundering at Egypt. Listen to me. You must listen, because the stakes are very high. Now can't you see? Death is coming to the cattle. Death is coming to your slaves. Death is coming to the land. Death is coming to the vegetation. And death will finally come to you. At what point will you listen to God? In verse 27, we're told that Pharaoh urgently sent for Moses and Aaron. This time, he knew the meaning of the storm, which I will explain what Pharaoh was hearing in that storm in the next rendering of this. This time he said, "I admit my fault. Yahweh is in the right. I and my subjects are in the wrong." Whoops. This is Pharaoh's first confession, but it's not his last one. It's his first confession. I admit my fault. In other words, God is right. I am wrong. I am a sinner. That is the very first thing, to acknowledge it. And he said, entreat the Lord to stop this thunder and the hail. In other words, please, please, please ask him urgently to take this away. And I promise to let you go, and you won't stay here any longer. In other words, Pharaoh is actually terrified. And he said, okay, I'll let you go, I'll let you go. How can anybody go in this storm? But he's asked that the storm would be removed. And so Moses answered, the moment I leave the city, I will stretch out my hands to the Lord. Notice, lift up your hands in prayer. If you lift up your hands in prayer and raise your head as well, your whole being is actually lifted up to God in prayer. And you find this in the Psalms as well. And Moses said, I will raise my hands to God in prayer. And you'll see that they win a battle against the Amalekites in the wilderness when Moses does that as well. It's very important. So it's reaching out to God, and raising your hands helps you to reach out to God. So he said, I will reach out to God. The thunder will stop and there will be no more hail. Now look at the ease with which Moses can declare that what is terrifying you at this moment, I can remove. Surely, surely, he will say to Moses, your God is the true God. Now, other kings who were pagans and persecutors of God's people, like Nebuchadnezzar in the 8th century, eventually said, your God is the God of gods. And so Moses said to Pharaoh, you must know that the earth belongs to God. The cobra in the Pharaoh's crown was his claim to the land of Goshen in the north. And Moses is saying that God is saying to you that the whole earth belongs to him. He is Lord. He is the creator. He is the only one who actually owns the earth. The rest of you can actually live on it, and so on. And Moses said to Pharaoh in verse 30, but as for you and your courtiers, I know very well that you have no fear of God in you yet. You don't fear Yahweh. Yes, you didn't like the signs that were given. Yes, you are terrified by the storms. But the fear of God is a different thing. The fear of God doesn't mean you're afraid of him. It means that you have a relationship of awe, wonder, and respect for God. And Moses is saying, I know you don't acknowledge Yahweh yet. I know you don't have respect for him. I know that while you ask me to pray to him, you yourself won't do it. I'll explain to you later that Pharaoh is responsible before his entire population for keeping the false religious system going. Just as in later centuries, the kings of Israel are responsible for keeping the covenant going among their people. So you've no fear of God yet. You've no intention of leaving your pantheon of gods and coming over. And so in verses 31 to 35, we're told that the hail did an awful lot of damage. The flax and the barley were ruined. Now, why would they specifically mention some of these crops? And I'll talk to you later about the fact that the flax was actually needed for the mummification process. The wheat and the spelt, because they were late crops, actually were not destroyed because they would come into maturity after the hail had passed. So Moses left Pharaoh and did what he said he would do, raised his hands to God, asked for the sign to be removed, and it was removed. But verse 35 said, but Pharaoh, as soon as he got relief, sinned again. Now this is the first time it is actually said that he sinned. He sinned against Yahweh. But he's also sinned against Moses because he has told him 7 times that he will let the people go. Well, not 7 times, but most of the time he has told them he would let the people go. And then he would put conditions on it, would make it impossible for them to go. He sinned again. Now, why is the text saying that Pharaoh has sinned? It's because Pharaoh has admitted fault, and he has admitted that the Lord is right. So we come into chapter 10, and we come to the 8th plague, which is actually as terrifying almost as the hail itself. So here we have the country again being plagued by flying insects. This is the 3rd time. It's very interesting. And you have to know that, in the Middle East and in Africa, a plague of locusts is not that rare. But you can have a plague of locusts and a plague of locusts. You can have a plague of locusts which is sort of normal, and then you can have something that's completely abnormal that would simply wipe out the whole harvest. And that was what came to Egypt. And they needed this sign because God was saying, I'm sorry, this game is up. I'm tired dealing with you. I am not going to pander to your pride any longer. And the locusts would therefore destroy the harvest, and the people would be facing starvation. Now, this is very important. Go back to the book of Genesis, and Egypt was the breadbasket of the world at the time. And to have Egypt facing starvation would have been a monumental problem, not only for Egypt itself, but for all the countries that depended on Egypt for wheat and barley and all the other crops. Because in many of the other countries, people were still living as migrating people, and they were moving from place to place, and so they didn't have a stable crop that they could depend on. So at the beginning of chapter 10, the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for it is I who have made his heart and the heart of his courtiers stubborn." In other words, God knew this was going to happen. He knew ab aeterno, so that I could work these signs. "And I will make fools of the Egyptians," is what the Jerusalem Bible says. If you go to the first letter of the Corinthians from St. Paul, he says that God turns the wisdom of the wise into foolishness, and that's what you're talking about here. In other words, all your worldly wisdom will do you no good whatsoever if you're faced with the presence and absolute power, holiness and purity and greatness of God himself. Forget about it. Worldly wisdom doesn't come there. And Paul goes on to tell you in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2 that only people who are spiritual understand the spiritual principles and understand what's going on at the higher plane, as Moses does. And if you don't understand what's going on at the higher plane, you'll follow the wisdom of the world, but that won't help you at all in dealing with this spiritual warfare. And so Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh again. Pharaoh must have hated the sight of them, and said to him, "This is the message of the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh." And then all of a sudden, Pharaoh was expecting the usual, let my people go 3 days into the wilderness. But that's not what he heard. God said, "How much longer will you refuse to submit to me?" That must have been a complete shock to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a demigod in Egypt. Nobody told him what to do, and nobody told him he had to surrender to absolutely anybody. But here was Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, saying to him, "You, like any other human being, has to surrender to the living God. You must. I am the Lord of the earth. I am the Creator and the Lord of the earth. El Elohim. Let my people go and offer me worship. If you refuse to go, then tomorrow I will send locusts to your country." Pharaoh is refusing something that Jesus put into the only prayer that he made. And since Jesus was God and he gave us only one prayer, that prayer is perfect. It says everything. And one of the statements in it is, "Thy will be done on earth." That is the issue in the Bible. And here is Pharaoh absolutely refusing to do God's will and refusing to cooperate in any way. So that's why the Lord says, "How much longer are you going to refuse to submit to me?" And so the terrible plague of locusts was sent, and it devoured everything. And verse 7 says, "And Pharaoh's courtiers came to him and said, 'How much longer is this man going to be the cause of our ruin?'" Now this time, not only has God told Pharaoh it's time to make a move, but his own government is saying to him, "How much longer is this man," meaning Moses, "going to cause the ruin of this land, and you're allowing it?" So Pharaoh is hearing that time is up, that your continued resistance is not acceptable. And the Jerusalem Bible says, "Let the people go to offer worship to the Lord your God." Now, there's a problem, and I've pointed out a number of difficulties with the Jerusalem Bible translation. The other translations say, "Let the men go to worship," because the men were the leaders of the families, the clans, the tribes, and the whole nation. It was not the women. And it was the men who would lead the worship. They would be the priests, they would be the sacrificers, they would lead the liturgy, and so on and so forth. And at no point Pharaoh actually said, "Let the people go and worship." But that was the very thing that Moses was fighting for, that the entire people of God, the men, the women, the children, their livestock, everything they possessed, would leave Egypt, just as back in Genesis when Jacob entered into Egypt, he brought everything with him, the men, the women, the children, the livestock, and everything he possessed. Now it was time for them to go. So Pharaoh has never, ever agreed to this. And how would he allow livestock to actually leave the country now that his own livestock have been decimated? He's not going to allow this at all. But it is the fact that the courtiers have now said, listen, this man you're dealing with has power, real power, terrifying power. Cooperate. And still the Pharaoh will refuse. Look what sinful nature is actually like. I'll continue this the next time. Slán agus banach dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.